Greetings, dear friends. Operational situation at the front on the 10th of February. Let's analyze in more detail today the Bakhmut, Avdiivskaya and Orkhov directions. We will start with the Skopinsko-Limenski section of the front, and we will start with the message that the enemy is still using Starling. Today, the first pictures were published in Avdiivka specifically. This means that the enemy uses Starling terminals, and reports that they are buying them. Of course, the main point here is that they use them, and of course these were messages. We also commented on this with you a little earlier. But this really affects the course of events, and there are also reports, directly from the fighters, that in Avdiivka itself the number of drones of Russian troops has increased sufficiently, and first of all, of course, this is also connected with Starling. And I mean reconnaissance drones, not only in Vey, that is, a fairly large number. Therefore, the enemy does not stand still, and as we see, they use what was previously an advantage for us, in terms of their advantage, namely Starling terminals. There is such a moment, but of course it will not only be Avdiivka, as we understand, it will be along the entire front line. Well, we start with the plot of Sinkovka-Kotlyarovka. Fighting continues both north of Sinkovka, and in the area of Tebayevka and Kotlyarovka. It means that Sinkovka's attacks were repelled, they had a positional character, but Kotlyarovka-Tebayevka's opponent here is currently preparing to increase pressure. In other words, there is information that infantry is being transferred to neighboring areas, namely to Vladimirovka, to forest plantations for more distant settlements. It's impossible to say it's frozen, but they are pulling up. In short, it means from the front section to Tebayevka, in order to increase pressure in the near future, as we have talked about before. Therefore, another rollback from the Russian troops is expected here. This refers to the Vladimirovka-Nizhnyaya Duvenka-Verkhnaya Duvenka. Some forces were scattered in this area, and are now being pulled up. But to date, we do not record any changes in this sector of the front. In the Limansky direction, there are still active hostilities in the area of Yar-Laptev and Balka Krug with varying success, and a dynamic situation remains in a number of areas, such as Yar-Laptev and Yar-Nir. Again, we do not record any changes, everything remains within the gray zone. According to Belagorovka, did any new information appear? Was it confirmed that Russian troops occupied the ledge of the gray zone, since there was an attack by an armored vehicle from one of the forest belts, and reached the center of the actually gray zone? A Russian armored vehicle was hit there. There was no additional information that they took a number of sites, a number of supports on this section of the front, so they are also making the main effort in the direction of the chalk quarry and the chalk pit. Not so much in the north direction from the positions of the station, the filter station in the north direction. So we do not record any changes here. But it is a fact that active hostilities are now taking place in this sector of the front. Somewhere it is possible to reflect, but the enemy also does not abandon attempts to improve the tactical situation. We have received clarifications on the Bakhmut direction, which we talked about yesterday. So, as you remember, there was an attack. Yesterday we added a gray zone, but we left a remark that the situation is being clarified, because there are a number of sections. The picture is not completely clear to the end, and so on and so on. But in general, today the picture is already clearer. The enemy advanced on a front section up to 1.5 kilometers wide, to a depth of 105 kilometers, and occupied the territory of the Popovsky forest. The situation is being further clarified, because a number of positions are still controversial. This is in the Popovsky forest, due to the fact that there were counterattacks from the Afu. So the information on this section of the front is not yet fully known, whether it was possible to knock out, or whether the enemy still gained a foothold completely in the Popovsky forest. And also information from about this area at the intersection of just the same road and railways. Whether the Russian troops were able to take control, and how things are in general here, it remains to be clarified. Well, in general, active hostilities are continuing, and what we talked about yesterday, the enemy as a whole, needs to be noticed. It's not only this section of the front, it's the same messages coming from Avdiivka. The enemy took advantage of the bad weather, of course, in order to carry out attacks. The fighters themselves are already reporting this. What we have talked about a lot is that there will be a bet on bad weather on the part of the Russian troops. In general, in short, active hostilities continue in this sector of the front. The enemy, naturally hooked on the Popovsky Forest, throws additional forces to attack, but not in the western, but in the northern direction, so the situation remains to be clarified yet. There was no new information received on the Ivanovskaya-Kleshivka front section, and we do not record any visual changes in the drone footage. But at the same time, active hostilities continue, and the opponents in this sector of the front do not abandon attempts to advance close to Ivanovo, occupying a number of forest belts located east, northeast and southeast of Ivanovo without changes. We proceed to the Avdiivka direction, along the northern flank, starting with the Steppe Burdik front section. It means that the enemy, as you remember, periodically attacks this section of the front. We talked about the fact that these attacks are more distracting in nature, and again there were a number of attacks from the enemy, but not with the aim of bypassing and entering the territory of one of the gullies north of the Burdik settlement, but to wedge between typical Burdiks, which means along one of the forest belts. The situation remains to be further clarified, but here, if we proceed from the vector of the enemy's attacks, the picture emerges that they are trying therefore, not to advance in the steppe itself, but to hit the oblique, from the Takmash Garden Association, go to the western, northwestern outskirts of the steppe, and from north to south, go down again but to the west of Stepovoy itself, that is, to bypass a number of strong positions of the Apu, which they have not been able to move in Stepovoy itself over the past few months. Therefore, the enemy's goals in this sector of the front are clear. The fighting continues actively. As for the north of Avdiivka, it means that further information has been received about the enemy's advance in the locality itself. In the area along the faces of Tipovoya and Pritchett Ravneva in the south direction, and at the shore of the sand pit, which we also said yesterday that there is most likely an advance there, because information has been received that they are moving along it. Well, what we talked about yesterday, unfortunately, has been confirmed today. Therefore, collectively, in this sector of the front, we note the enemy's advance up to 350 meters wide, to a depth of 150 meters. Here, bearing in mind 350, this is by locality, and accordingly, the repainting of the quarry itself. Alignment by, therefore, the positions of the dachas. Are the assault operations continuing? Yes, they continue. The situation is dynamic enough, and with varying success, because they have been storming the dachas themselves for several days. As you understand, we comment on this, but they managed to stop them somewhere, to throw back counterattacks somewhere. Artillery works according to their position, drones with drops, as far as possible, but the enemy, his main task, we have already said, is precisely a bridgehead in the northern part of Avdiivka, to transfer personnel as much as possible in order to make it difficult for the Afu to counterattack, and the likelihood of knocking out the enemy from the northern part of the settlement. Well, the main second goal is also, of course, to break through from their side, to the intersection of roads on 0542 and Industrial Avenue, near the Brevno complex. There are also reports of a car attack on the territory of the carpool. Well, here, we need to make a remark, that active hostilities are continuing, so there is no clear information yet today. But, we can see that the enemy continues to push. The situation, they asked to clarify whether it has changed, whether there are any data, because there are many reports, that they will try to strike their main blow further not in the south direction, but so to speak, to surround Avdiivsky as a Sahim, that is, to take the supply road, it is 542, and from two directions of encirclement whether they made their way to the dachas of Avdiivka Kok. No information was received on the dachas. To date, visual new confirmations of any georeferenced information have not been received either. How likely is the environment of Avdiivsky as a Sohim? We will look at the fact. Now, the situation is unpredictable and complicated. Let's talk as it is. Because if we are talking about the southern flank, we see that absolute positionality has been observed here for more than a week, that is, there are a lot of attacks from the enemy, and so not only the Tsarskaya Okhota complex and along Sobornaya Street. There are attempts to still advance along the landing in the north direction, bypass the Donetsk filter station. There are attempts to move along one of the routes in the direction of Chebarashka, to come close to it, to approach along the railway line as close as possible to the Garden Association. In other words, a lot of attempts on the part of the enemy are being made on this sector of the front, but it is possible to repel. That is, relative stabilization is observed. At the same time, all of these actions can be offset by the fact that the enemy is advancing in the north. This must also be understood. Therefore, his main bet is going to the north now. This is the situation we have in Avdiivka. Here, of course, everything will depend on how much it will be possible to repel their attacks, well, roughly speaking, from the Brevno complex to the Avdiivskaya carpool. This is the area that is really very important for them, on which they are betting, in order to divide the forces of the armed forces in two. Well, of course, to interrupt any, let's say, relatively normal logistics to the central and southern parts of Avdiivka. This also needs to be perfectly understood, so the situation is very, very difficult. At the same time, we state that the APU does not leave their positions, as reported by a number of enemy resources, that they are fleeing. No, in the east of Avdiivka, all positions are held, both the filter station and the area of garden associations. But the enemy is pressing here, it is possible to restrain. But again, everything can be leveled by the advance from the north. There is such a moment. Moving on. May Day. The assault operations continue, and we do not record any changes at the positions of Vostok-Nonovelsky and in Pervomaysky itself. At the same time, today we received information from the Kurakovsky direction. We added a small section of the gray zone, because the situation is being clarified. There are a number of reports, a number of Russian military commanders report, that Russian troops managed to make a breakthrough to Gagarin Street. Gagarin Street in Georgievka, it actually begins here. How much does this correspond to reality? Well, it's unlikely, that's what I'm saying from my side. But nevertheless, attempts to advance along the Garden Association, which is adjacent directly to the central street. Yes, there is from the enemy's side, and it must be taken into account that he has a northern flank. There are positions to the north, from which he can fire, adjust artillery, aerial reconnaissance, drone operators. Therefore, the fact that he would be activated by the Garden Association was understandable for alignment. Regarding the alignment of the front line, because then the APU would have an advantage here. It remained for the APU. The adjustment and work of drone operators is the pressure. Therefore, the situation remains for further clarification. But that jerk, which is reported by the enemy, is of course unlikely. At the same time, there are also attempts to advance two sections in the direction of victory. The first one is along the road about 0532. The second section of the attack is from the area of Mariinka itself, in the direction of one of the supports near an abandoned field reservoir. There are attacks, it is possible to repel. There are also attempts along this route to move in a northerly direction, but they had a positional character. An attempt was made to advance to the intersection, had a positional character. Very heavy fighting continues in Novomikhailovka. To date, further information has been received. Yesterday, we commented on the information that there is a lot of contradictory information. Someone says that they managed to recapture a number of positions. Russian troops were knocked out on the outskirts. But today, there is already a message that they have advanced further, that is, they failed to knock out them. Further on the Novomikhailovka itself, I will only say that the situation remains under clarification, because it is really dynamic. The fact that the enemy is coming in, we saw from the geolinking of drone frames, several points were just marked. This is about this point, one of the buildings, and in the area of the forest belt. The presence of the enemy was also recorded in this area. It is possible to knock out somewhere, but naturally he pulled up his strength. This is very important to note. The fighters themselves report directly from the field that they have tightened their forces, and in the near future, we will observe assault actions. I think that for 3 or 4 days, they will definitely actively attack the settlement itself, based on the information that is available. Therefore, it needs further clarification. The main fighting within the gray zone remains approximately in this area. Pressure from the east and southeast of the locality. We turn to the Orekhovsky section of the work front. In this sector of the front, there are further improvements in tactical positions on the part of the AFU. It was possible to throw back the Russian troops to knock them out from the support, where, as you remember, there were shots of Russian troops entering the strongholds. There was an advance about a month and a half ago, along one of the forest belts in the direction of the work itself, to the bottom. According to the latest information, it was possible to knock out and take control of the entire stronghold, with its branch into a small landing. The situation for yesterday, the situation for today. In total, we note the progress in a section up to 1 kilometer wide, to a depth of 380 meters. Therefore, in this sector of the front, as we see, there is a third improvement. We state the last one. This is January-February. Therefore, although the enemy made a big bet in order to reach the Uspinovskaya beam, such as from the area of Verbovoy Kapani, they managed to repel these attacks and even improve their tactical positions. At the same time, for the enemy, it should be noted that Avdiivka is now a priority, and it cannot be said that he will abandon this direction and will not attack. Therefore, it is naturally necessary to prepare for the fact that there may be an increase here. Although after Avdiivka, as reported by the enemy's resources, the priority remains for them, first of all, it is for the market. Not so much offensive actions on Novomykhailovka, on a number of other sites, as the alignment of the front line. Stabilization on the left bank of the Dnieper. There, in addition to the market, there are a number of positions, for which they are very worried right now, so that there is no attempt on the part of the APU to create a second bridgehead, against the background of the fact that, well, there are such small tactical successes. And in the Kamensky area, we noted a clarification a few days ago, because there were shots of the APU advancing along one of the forest belts, and we see that in the whole Zaporozhye sector of the front. Despite the fact that the APU is working with small forces, the enemy has a number of problems, including with a counter-battery, which he complains regularly. This is the situation we have at the front today. Before the evening broadcast, be healthy.